There is a reason the other species in the galaxy check their targeting systems 3 times before they even think about raising their shields against a human vessel. And today, that reason was about to be reminded to an entire armada in the most violent and spectacular way possible. The internal sensors of the UNS Valkyrie had just picked up a signature that every single crew member on board had been trained to recognize since their first day at the Academy. A Draxon War signature. But this one was different. This one was stupid. This one was coming in hot with their shields barely holding at 12%. And that single detail told Commander Sarah Chun everything she needed to know about what was coming and exactly how she was going to end it. She stood on the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the main display screen as the red blip grew larger and larger, and beside her, her second-in-command Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb was already pulling up fleet deployment protocols on his console, because he knew, just like every other human on that ship knew, that when a Draxon came at you with low shields, it was not a mistake, it was a challenge, and humans had never once in their entire history of space travel turned down a challenge. The Draxon Empire had been a thorn in the side of the Galactic Council for over 600 years, a reptilian species that stood nearly 9 feet tall with scales that could deflect low-caliber rounds and eyes that could track movement across 3 spectrums of light simultaneously. And they had used every single one of those biological advantages to terrorize every species they had ever encountered. From the delicate Ilthri, who could barely lift a rifle, to the armored Kathrani who could withstand temperatures that would melt steel. The Draxons had fought them all, and the Draxons had won. Or at least they had won until 47 years ago when humanity arrived on the galactic stage, and suddenly the Draxon victory record started collecting losses faster than a slot machine in a collapse economy. Nobody in the galaxy really understood what made humans so dangerous at first. The other species looked at these soft-skinned creatures with no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no enhanced senses, and they genuinely believed that humanity would be just another minor species to catalog and forget. But then the first Draxon raiding party hit a human colony, and the aftermath was so one-sided that the Galactic Council actually sent investigators because they thought the reports were fabricated. Exaggerations designed to scare the Draxons into compliance. But the investigators arrived at the colony and found the remains of 47 Draxon warriors scattered across a perimeter that the humans had defended with nothing but basic firearms, and what the investigators later described in their official report as a complete and total disregard for their own survival that bordered on pathological. That was the secret that humanity had never tried to hide, but that the rest of the galaxy kept failing to understand. Humans did not fight like other species. Other species fought to win. They calculated odds. They retreated when the situation became unfavorable. They surrendered when defeat was certain. But humans did not do any of those things. Humans fought to destroy. And if destroying the enemy meant destroying themselves in the process, then humans would simply consider that an acceptable trade and adjust their tactics accordingly. The Draxons had learned this lesson the hard way over 4 decades of conflict, losing ship after ship and fleet after fleet to a species that they physically outmatched in every conceivable category. And yet here they were again, sending a flagship into human-patrolled space with shields that could barely stop a microwave. And Sarah Chin knew with absolute certainty that this was not an accident. This was a message. And she was going to respond to that message with the only language that the Draxons had ever proven they could understand. She turned to Marcus and gave the order that every human commander dreamed of giving from the moment they received their commission: all hands to battle stations, Fleet Deployment Protocol 7, and tell the boarding teams to warm up, because something told her that this fight was going to get personal before it was over. The klaxons began screaming throughout the ship, that particular pitch that every human sailor and spacer had heard in simulations and drills, but that always hit different when it was real. When the blood started pumping and the adrenaline started flooding, and that ancient predator instinct that humanity had never lost despite centuries of civilization started clawing its way to the surface and across the Valkyrie. 512 human beings went from their relaxed duty stations to full combat readiness in under 90 seconds, which was still 12 seconds slower than the record, but was fast enough that the Draxon flagship would not have time to reconsider its approach before the storm hit them. The Draxon flagship was called the Blood Sovereign in their own tongue, though human intelligence had translated it more accurately as the vessel of unending conquest. and it was the single largest warship in the Draxon fleet, stretching over 4 kilometers from bow to stern with enough firepower to crack a planetoid in half and enough troop capacity to stage a ground invasion on a moderate-sized colony world. And normally it traveled with an escort fleet that would make any admiral in the galaxy sweat. But today, it was alone, running dark with only those pitiful 12% shields flickering like a dying candle. And that image alone told Narration more about Draxon psychology than 600 years of diplomatic briefings ever had, because the Draxons were proud, devastatingly proud, and their pride had finally crossed the line from arrogance into something that could only be described as suicidal. And she respected that in a way because humans understood suicidal pride better than any species in the universe. They had built entire civilizations on it. The Valkyrie was not a flagship. It was a heavy cruiser, the workhorse of the United Nations Space Command, designed to be fast enough to respond to threats across multiple systems and tough enough to survive whatever it found when it got there. And compared to the Blood Sovereign, it looked like a toy, barely 800 meters long with a fraction of the firepower and a crew that was 1/20th the size. But the Draxons had made the same mistake that every other species kept making when they looked at human ships. They were judging the ship and not the people inside it. They were looking at the metal and the weapons and the shield ratings, and they were completely missing the fact that the 800 humans on board that cruiser had been raised on a planet where their own atmosphere tried to kill them, where their own sun gave them cancer, where they had to cook their food because their digestive systems were too weak to handle raw meat like every proper predator in the animal kingdom. And despite all of that, they had climbed to the top of their food chain and then looked up at the stars and said, "You are next." And that was the energy that was radiating through every deck of the Valkyrie as the distance between the two ships closed from 50,000 kilometers to 30,000 to 20,000. Marcus looked up from his console and reported that the Draxon ship was not adjusting course, not accelerating, not decelerating. It was just coming straight at them on a collision vector with those pathetic shields still barely holding. And Sarah nodded because she had expected nothing less. The Draxons wanted this to be close. They wanted this to be personal. They wanted to look into human eyes before they killed them because they genuinely believed that their size and their strength and their centuries of warrior culture would carry the day in close quarters, and Narration was about to demonstrate exactly why that belief had gotten more Draxons killed than any weapon in human inventory. She opened a fleet channel and spoke calmly and clearly, and every human within range heard her voice and understood exactly what she was saying without her needing to spell it out. She said, "Valkyrie actual to all ships in sector. We have a Draxon flagship on intercept course, shields at 12%. No escort, no deception. They want to fight, and I intend to give them what they want. All ships maintain formation and prepare for close quarters engagement." And she paused for exactly 1 second before adding the phrase that had become humanity's calling card across the galaxy. "Remember what we are." And then she closed the channel, and the silence on the bridge lasted for exactly 2 heartbeats before every station started reporting ready status in rapid succession. The Fleet Deployment Protocol 7 that Sarah had ordered was something that the Galactic Council had formally requested humanity stop using after the incident at Station Kale 4 years earlier. A request that humanity had acknowledged and then completely ignored because the protocol was arguably the most effective anti-capital ship tactic that any species had ever developed, and humans were not about to stop using their best tricks just because the other species found it unsettling, which was a word that appeared in official council documents with alarming frequency whenever the topic of human military tactics came up. And the reason it was unsettling was simple. Protocol 7 was not designed to destroy an enemy ship from the outside. It was designed to get humans inside the enemy ship. And everything that happened after that was classified by the human military under a designation that roughly translated to the kind of thing that gives counselors nightmares. 3 support frigates broke from the Valkyrie's formation and took up positions around the approaching Draxon flagship, not to attack, but to harass, their weapons firing precise bursts at the already weakened shields, not enough to bring them down entirely, but enough to keep the Draxon point defense systems occupied. And while the Draxon crew was focused on those 3 annoying gnats circling their massive warship, the Valkyrie was doing something that no other species would have even considered because it violated every principle of naval warfare that had been established over millennia of space combat. The Valkyrie was accelerating directly toward the Blood Sovereign on a perpendicular angle that would bring them alongside the larger ship at a distance of less than 200 meters, and at that range. The Draxon ship's main batteries would be useless because they were designed to hit targets at tens of thousands of kilometers and could not depress their firing arcs. Enough to track a ship that was essentially parked next to them. And that was the genius of Protocol 7. It turned the enemy's greatest strength, their size and firepower, into their greatest weakness, and it gave humans the one thing they had always been better at than any other species in the galaxy: the close fight. The internal sensors of the Valkyrie were fully engaged now. Every deck, every corridor, every compartment was being monitored by an array of systems that had been specifically designed and refined over decades of conflict with species that liked to board human ships. And the irony was not lost on Sarah that all the technology that humanity had developed to defend against boarding parties was now being used to prepare an offensive boarding action of their own. But that was humanity in a nutshell. Every tool was a weapon, and every weapon was a tool, and the distinction between defense and offense was a philosophical question that humans had answered a long time ago by deciding that the best defense was making sure the other guy was too dead to attack you again. The sensor feeds were showing her everything she needed to see. Her boarding teams suiting up in the deployment base, the Marine contingents checking their weapons one final time, the medics preparing their kits with the particular grim efficiency that said they expected to use everything they had packed, and Sarah watched all of this on her displays with the calm stillness of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what was coming. The distance between the Valkyrie and the Blood Sovereign was now 5,000 kilometers and closing fast, and the Draxon ship finally reacted to the 3 frigates that had been peppering its shields. A pair of point defense turrets swiveled and opened fire on the nearest frigate, the shots lighting up the void like brief suns. And the frigate juked and weaved with the kind of reckless agility that only a human crew could pull off because human pilots had a tendency to treat their ships like extensions of their own bodies and push them to tolerances that the manufacturers insisted were unsafe, which was exactly why human pilots kept winning dogfights against species that had faster ships and better targeting computers. Because a computer would never voluntarily push a ship past 90% of its structural tolerance, but a human would push it to 110% without even thinking about it, and then ask for more. The frigate avoided the Draxon fire easily and returned a salvo that cracked another chunk off the already failing shields, and Sarah watched the shield percentage drop from 12 to 9 to 7 and knew that the moment was approaching. At 2,000 kilometers, she gave the order that would define this engagement in the history books that would be written about it later. She said prepare for magnetic anchor deployment, and across the Valkyrie a set of systems that most ships in the galaxy did not even possess began to power up. Massive electromagnetic launchers that could fire heavy tungsten spikes into an enemy hull and then magnetize them to create an unbreakable physical tether between two ships. And the reason most species did not have this technology was not because they could not build it, but because the concept of physically attaching your ship to an enemy vessel during combat was so fundamentally contrary to every established doctrine of space warfare that no other species had ever even considered it worth developing. But humans had developed it, tested it, refined it, and deployed it in combat 17 times over the past 6 years, and in all 17 cases the result had been the same: the enemy ship was boarded, the enemy crew was destroyed, and the enemy ship was either captured or scuttled, and the Draxons knew all of this because human intelligence had made sure of it, which meant that the captain of the Blood Sovereign knew exactly what was about to happen and was choosing to let it happen anyway. And that detail alone made Saracen pause for just a moment, because even by human standards that level of stubborn pride was impressive. At 800 meters the magnetic anchors fired. 6 massive tungsten spikes erupted from the Valkyrie's port side and crossed the gap between the two ships in less than a second, each one punching through the Draxon hull plating with a concussive impact that was felt through the deck plating of both vessels. And then the magnets engaged, and the two ships were locked together with a force that would require a capital ship's main engines to break. And for a single instant, there was silence on the Valkyrie's bridge as both ships adjusted to the new reality of being physically connected. And then the internal sensors lit up like a festival as they detected movement throughout the Draxon ship, hundreds of heat signatures converging on the breach points. And Sarah said simply, "They know we are coming." and Marcus replied, "They are coming to meet us." And Sarah smiled, the particular smile that her crew had learned to associate with the calm before a very specific type of storm. The boarding teams launched from the deployment bays in armored drop pods that shot across the 200-meter gap on magnetic rails, each pod carrying 6 Marines in full combat gear. And the pods hit the Draxon hull around the anchor points and deployed cutting charges that blew open entry holes in the enemy ship's outer plating. And one by one the teams poured into the Blood Sovereign like water through a cracked dam. And the internal sensors of the Valkyrie tracked every single Marine's biosignature as they moved into the enemy vessel, each one a bright but on the display that represented a human being who had voluntarily chosen to enter a 4-kilometer-long warship filled with 9-foot-tall reptilian warriors who wanted nothing more than to tear them apart with their bare hands. And the display showed those bright dots moving forward without hesitation, without pause, without the slightest indication that any of them considered this situation to be anything other than exactly what they had trained for. The first contact happened 17 seconds after the first team entered, and the internal sensor feed showed it in perfect clarity. 12 Draxon warriors had set up a defensive position at a corridor junction roughly 300 meters from the nearest breach point, and they had chosen that junction because it was narrow enough that their superior size would work in their favor, forcing the humans to approach in smaller numbers where the Draxons could use their reach and strength to maximum effect. And by every tactical model that any other species would have run, this was a sound defensive position that should have been able to hold against a force 3 times its size. But the humans did not use those tactical models because those models were built on assumptions about self-preservation that humans did not share, and instead of advancing carefully through the junction, the lead Marine threw a stun grenade around the corner and then charged through the resulting flash and smoke before the Draxons had even blinked. And what followed was 8 seconds of close-quarters violence that the internal sensors recorded as a series of rapidly moving biosignatures, and then 12 Draxon life signs went dark and 6 human signatures kept moving forward without stopping. Sarah watched the feed and noted that the Marine team had not taken a single casualty in that first engagement, and she knew that this would not last because the Draxons would adapt. They were not stupid. They were cruel and proud and aggressive, but they were not stupid. And they would quickly realize that their standard defensive tactics were useless against an enemy that did not value its own survival enough to be cautious. And when that realization hit, the Draxons would do what they always did when their plans failed. They would abandon strategy entirely and rely on brute force and numbers. And that was fine because humans had been dealing with bigger, stronger enemies since before they had figured out how to make fire. And the entire history of human combat could be summarized as a long, continuous lesson in how to kill things that should by all rights be able to kill you first. The second and third teams entered through their respective breach points and began moving through the ship according to the plan that Sarah had laid out during the approach. Each team had a specific objective. Team 1 was heading for the bridge, Team 2 was heading for engineering, and Team 3 was moving through the lower decks to clear crew quarters and secure any Draxon personnel they found for intelligence purposes. Although based on past experience, everyone knew that securing Draxon prisoners was easier said than done because Draxons would rather die than be captured by humans, which was a sentiment that the humans found both understandable and irrelevant because they were going to try anyway, because that was what humans did. They tried, even when success was unlikely, even when the odds were terrible, even when every rational calculation said it was not worth the effort. Humans tried. And that persistent, irrational effort was the single most dangerous quality that humanity possessed because it meant that humans never stopped. They never gave up. They never accepted a loss as final. They just kept coming and kept trying and kept fighting until either they won or they were literally too dead to continue. And the Draxons were about to experience that quality up close and personal for the next several minutes. Team 1 was making the fastest progress, which made sense because they had the most direct route to their objective, and they were led by Sergeant Major James Okonkwo, a man who stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 185 pounds, and who had personally killed more Draxons in close-quarters combat than some entire ground warfare divisions had managed across entire campaigns. And the reason for this was not that Okonkwo was some kind of super soldier or genetic anomaly. The reason was that Okonkwo understood something about fighting that most species never grasped. He understood that violence was not about strength or speed or size. It was about commitment. It was about the willingness to do something that the other person was not willing to do. And Okonkwo was willing to do absolutely anything to win a fight. And when a 9-foot-tall Draxon warrior with scales like armor and claws like knives came at him, Okonkwo did not try to match strength with strength. He let the Draxon commit to its attack, and then he moved inside its reach where its size became a disadvantage, and he did things with a combat knife and a sidearm that the Draxon's nervous system could not process fast enough to defend against. And then the Draxon was dead, and Okonkwo was moving on to the next one. The internal sensors showed Team 1 advancing through a long corridor that ran along the spine of the Blood Sovereign. And the corridor was wide enough that the Draxons had positioned warriors at intervals along both sides, creating a crossfire zone that should have been impassable. And Okonkwo saw this on his helmet display and called his team together and said something that his comm system picked up and relayed back to the Valkyrie, where Sarah heard it and smiled again. He said, "They want us to go through the middle, so do not go through the middle." And then he pointed to the deck plating and said, "We go through the floor." And his team immediately understood and began placing breaching charges on the deck, while 2 members provided suppressive fire that kept the Draxon warriors pinned in their positions. And when the charges blew, the floor of the corridor collapsed downward into the deck below, and the entire team dropped through the hole and found themselves in a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the one above, but had no Draxon defenders because the Draxons had not thought to defend below the floor, because no other species in the galaxy would have thought to go through the floor. But humans went through floors and walls and ceilings and windows and any other barrier that stood between them and their objective, because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history figuring out how to get past obstacles, and that problem-solving instinct was now being applied to the problem of how to kill every Draxon between them and the bridge. Team 2 had a harder time getting to engineering because the Draxons had correctly identified engineering as a critical target and had concentrated a significant force there. Nearly 80 warriors according to the internal sensors, and Team 2 only had 36 Marines, and by any conventional arithmetic, that should have been an impossible fight. But Team 2's commander, Lieutenant Vasquez, had been trained by humans and therefore did not do conventional arithmetic when it came to combat. She did human arithmetic, which was a completely different mathematical system that operated on principles that other species found incomprehensible. Principles like the idea that 3 humans fighting in a confined space could kill 20 Draxons if the humans were willing to accept that some of them would probably die in the process. And Vasquez's team was more than willing. They were eager. They were actually looking forward to it. And the internal sensors picked up the bio readings of 36 human bodies whose heart rates were elevated but stable. The signature of controlled aggression that human medics had learned to recognize as the optimal state for combat effectiveness. And Vasquez looked at her team and said, "Simply remember your training and trust the person next to you." And then she led them into the engineering section, and the sensors lost track of individual movements for approximately 4 minutes because the fighting was too close and too fast for the system to distinguish between friendly and hostile signatures with any precision. And when the interference cleared, there were 23 human signatures still active and 0 Draxon signatures remaining in the engineering section. And Sarah noted the casualty count and felt the particular weight that every commander felt when they saw the numbers. 12 Marines killed or wounded in 4 minutes of fighting. And she filed that weight away in the place where all commanders kept such things because there would be time to process it later, but right now there was still a war to win. Team 3 was having the kind of experience that only humans could have in a combat situation. They were clearing the crew quarters and finding Draxon civilians, which was unexpected because the Blood Sovereign was supposed to be a warship and warships did not typically carry civilians. But the internal sensors were picking up smaller biosignatures mixed in with the warrior signatures, Draxon juveniles, and what appeared to be support staff, and the team leader Corporal Kim reported this back to the Valkyrie, and Sarah made a decision in less than 2 seconds because that was how fast human commanders made decisions when the situation demanded it. She told Team 3 to secure the civilians and continue clearing, but to minimize collateral damage where possible. And this order was remarkable not because of its content, but because of its context. Here were humans in the middle of a vicious close-quarters battle on an enemy warship, surrounded by hostiles who wanted to kill them. And Their commander was telling them to be careful about not hurting the enemy's non-combatants. And the reason this was remarkable was that no other species in the galaxy would have even considered issuing such an order, because no other species had the cognitive bandwidth to simultaneously fight for their lives and worry about the welfare of the enemy's families. But humans did exactly that. Humans could hold two completely contradictory ideas in their heads at the same time and act on both of them. Simultaneously, they could be trying to kill every Draxon warrior on the ship while also trying to protect Draxon children. And they did not see any contradiction in this, because to a human mind, compassion and violence were not opposites, they were tools. And a human would use whatever tool was appropriate for the situation without wasting time worrying about whether the tools were philosophically consistent. The fighting on the lower decks was intensifying as Team 3 moved deeper into the crew quarters, and the internal sensors showed a pattern that human analysts had seen before in Draxon ship combat. The Draxon warriors were deliberately positioning themselves near the civilian areas, using the presence of juveniles and non-combatants as a form of passive protection because they absolutely knew, that humans would slow down and be more careful when civilians were present, and this was a tactic that the Draxons had developed specifically for fighting humans because it was useless against every other species in the galaxy, since no other species would have slowed down in the first place. But humans would. Humans always would. And the Draxons exploited this human compassion with the cold calculation of a predator that has identified a weakness in its prey. And Corporal Kim recognized the tactic immediately and called back to the Valkyrie to report it. And Sarah listened and felt something shift inside her, something cold and hard that had been forged in 4 decades of conflict with a species that would use its own children as tactical advantages. And she said into the comm channel with a voice that had gone completely flat and emotionless, "Tell the Draxon warriors that they have 30 seconds to move away from the civilian areas, or we will no longer be careful." And Marcus looked at her, because that was not standard protocol, and standard protocol existed for reasons. And Sarah looked back at him and said, "They want to use our compassion against us, fine, but they need to understand that our compassion has limits, and those limits end when our people start dying, because we were being too nice to shoot through a wall." And Marcus nodded because he understood. He understood that humanity's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability, and that the Draxons had learned to exploit that vulnerability, and that the only way to stop the exploitation was to demonstrate that the exploitation had a cost, and Sarah's ultimatum was that cost. The 30 seconds passed, and the Draxon warriors did not move, because of course they did not move. They had called humanity's bluff before, and it had always worked because humans always backed down when civilians were at risk. They always chose caution over aggression when children were involved, and the Draxons had counted on that consistency for years. But what the Draxons did not understand, what they had never understood, was that human consistency was not weakness. Human consistency was a choice, and choices could be changed. And when the 30 seconds expired and Sarah Chun gave the order to advance with full authorization to fire through barriers if necessary, the Draxon warriors discovered in the most direct way possible that humanity's reputation for compassion was not a guarantee. It was a courtesy, and courtesies could be withdrawn. Team 3 resumed their advance, and this time they did not slow down at the civilian areas. They did not take extra care with their angles of fire. They moved with the same aggressive speed that Teams 1 and 2 had been using from the beginning. And the internal sensors showed the Draxon warrior positions collapsing almost immediately because the warriors had been counting on the human reluctance to fight near civilians, and when that reluctance disappeared, their entire defensive strategy became worthless, and the Draxon warriors found themselves in a fight with humans who were no longer being careful, and the difference was immediately apparent in the casualty numbers on both sides. Within 3 minutes, Team 3 had cleared the entire lower deck section with only 2 additional Marine casualties. And the civilian Draxon casualties were significantly lower than they would have been if the Draxons had not tried to use them as shields in the first place, which was a mathematical irony that Sarah noted but did not comment on because there would be time for analysis later. On the bridge approach, Team 1 was encountering the heaviest resistance of the entire operation because the Draxon command staff had realized that the humans were making a play for the bridge and had concentrated every available warrior between Team 1's current position and the bridge entrance. and the internal sensors showed a choke point that was genuinely impressive by any standard. A narrow corridor that led to the bridge's main hatch with warriors stacked 3 deep on both sides and additional warriors positioned on overhead catwalks that gave them a height advantage. And Okonkwo looked at this on his display and called his team together and said the thing that every human commander says when faced with an impossible defensive position. He said, "We go through it." And his team responded with the thing that every human soldier says in that situation, which was nothing at all. They just checked their weapons and got ready because words were unnecessary when everyone already understood what was about to happen and what their roles were and what the acceptable losses were, and none of them were going to object or hesitate because they were human and humans did not object to impossible odds. They simply adjusted their definition of possible and got to work. Okonkwo deployed his team in a formation that no tactical manual from any other species would have recommended because it involved splitting his force into pairs and sending each pair into the choke point individually with staggered timing. And the reason other species would not recommend this is that it meant each pair would be fighting alone against dozens of enemies with no support. But the reason it worked for humans is that each pair was not actually alone. They were connected by training and trust and the absolute certainty that the pair behind them would be right behind them, and the pair in front of them had already cleared as much of the killing zone as they could before going down. And so the first pair went in, and they drew fire from every direction, and they killed 4 Draxons between them before they were brought down, and the internal sensors showed their biosignatures go critical. And the second pair was already in motion before the first pair hit the deck, and they killed 6 Draxons and wounded 3 more before they fell. And the third pair entered and killed 8, and the fourth pair killed 11, and the fifth pair killed 9, and the sixth pair killed 7, and by the time the 7th pair entered the choke point, there were fewer than 10 Draxon warriors still standing, and Okonkwo himself was the 8th pair, because he had held himself in reserve not out of cowardice, but out of calculation, because he knew that the final push would need someone who could finish the fight cleanly and quickly. And he entered the killing zone, and the remaining Draxons saw him coming, and something in their 3-spectrum eyes must have recognized what he was, because 2 of them actually tried to retreat, which was unheard of for Draxon warriors, and Okonkwo did not let them retreat. He killed them all in 11 seconds, and then he was at the bridge hatch, and the internal sensors showed him placing a breaching charge, and the bridge was about to fall. Sarah watched all of this on the main display, and she felt the particular tension that commanders feel when the decisive moment approaches, the moment when all the planning and all the fighting and all the dying is about to either result in victory or turn into a disaster. And she knew that Okonkwo was about to breach the bridge, and that the bridge would be defended by the Draxon ship's senior officers, who would be the most experienced and dangerous warriors on the entire vessel. And she also knew that Okonkwo had lost most of his team getting to this point, and was down to 3 Marines, including himself, and 4 humans against however many Draxon officers were on that bridge was not good odds by any calculation except the calculation that humans used, which was the calculation that said 4 humans who refused to stop fighting were worth more than any number of enemies who could be convinced to stop. And Okonkwo had never been convinced to stop fighting in his entire life. The breaching charge blew, and the internal sensors momentarily lost contact with Okonkwo's biosignature, because the explosion disrupted the tracking, and for 2 seconds the bridge of the Valkyrie was completely silent, and then Okonkwo's signature reappeared on the display along with 3 other signatures, and they were inside the bridge, and the sensor feed showed 17 hostile signatures on the bridge with them. 17 Draxon officers in close quarters with 4 humans, and the next 90 seconds on the Valkyrie's bridge were the longest 90 seconds of Sarah Chen's career, and she stood perfectly still with her hands still clasped behind her back and watched the display as the biosignatures moved and flickered and went dark one by one. And when it was over, there were 4 human signatures still active on the bridge and 0 Draxon signatures, and Sarah let out a breath that she had not realized she had been holding. The Blood Sovereign was theirs. The bridge was secured. Engineering was secured. The crew quarters were secured. And the internal sensors showed that the remaining Draxon personnel throughout the ship were either dead, wounded, or in the process of being contained by the Marine teams. And Sarah looked at the display and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction before she started giving the next set of orders, because the fight was not over. Taking the ship was only the first half of The operation in the second half was the part that would be remembered, the part that would make the Draxon Empire think twice before ever sending another flagship into human space with low shields and high confidence. She opened a channel to Okonkwo on the bridge of the Blood Sovereign and said, "Sergeant Major, you have done exceptional work. Now get my ship's systems connected to their main computer and pull everything you can find: navigation logs, communication records, fleet deployments, personnel files, everything." And Okonkwo acknowledged, and his team began the technical work of integrating human systems with Draxon technology, which was something that human cyber warfare specialists had become disturbingly good at over the years, because the Draxons kept underestimating human technical capabilities and kept using encryption systems that humans had cracked years ago and refused to update, because updating would be admitting that humans had cracked them, and the Draxons would rather die than admit that. And so human intelligence had been reading Draxon military communications for the better part of 2 decades, and the Draxons still had not figured it out. Or if they had figured it out, they had decided that admitting it was worse than letting it continue, which was a level of pride-induced stupidity that even humans found difficult to comprehend. While Okonkwo's team worked on the computer systems, Sarah turned her attention to the broader tactical picture, because the Blood Sovereign had been alone when it arrived, but that did not mean it would stay alone, and her sensor officers were scanning the surrounding space for any sign of a Draxon relief force. And the scans came back clean, no other Draxon signatures within sensor range, which meant either the Draxons had genuinely sent their flagship alone as some kind of gesture, or there were ships running dark outside of standard sensor range. And Sarah did not believe in the first option, so she prepared for the second and ordered the fleet to maintain defensive formation around the captured vessel. The data that Okonkwo's team was pulling from the Blood Sovereign's computers started flowing into the Valkyrie's systems 20 minutes after the bridge was secured, and the first thing that Sarah saw made her blood run cold for exactly 1 second before the cold was replaced by something hotter and more dangerous, because the data showed that the Blood Sovereign had not come to this sector by accident. It had not been on patrol. It had not been lost. It had been sent here specifically, sent to this exact location, to engage the Valkyrie specifically. And the reason was in the next set of files that Okonkwo transmitted, which contained a Draxon intelligence briefing that identified Sarah Chun by name and listed her as the primary target of the operation. And the briefing included her service record, her combat history, her known tactical preferences, and a psychological profile that had clearly been compiled by someone who understood human psychology, because it accurately predicted that Sarah would respond to a lone flagship with low shields by closing to boarding range rather than maintaining distance and using conventional weapons. And Sarah read this and understood something that changed the entire context of the engagement. The Draxons had not been arrogant. They had not been stupid. They had been strategic. They had deliberately presented a target that they knew Sarah would not be able to resist, and they had sent their flagship to be the bait, and the question that immediately followed was bait for what? She looked at Marcus and said, "They knew we were coming. They knew exactly how I would respond. This was a trap." And Marcus started scanning the sensor data again with renewed intensity, and this time he found what they had missed before: a signal, faint and intermittent, coming from a point approximately 120,000 kilometers away, just at the edge of standard sensor range. And the signal had the characteristics of a Draxon fleet communication burst, which meant there were ships out there, ships that had been watching the entire engagement, ships that were waiting for something. And Sarah understood now what they were waiting for. They were waiting for the Valkyrie to commit fully to the boarding action, which it had. They were waiting for the human forces to be distributed throughout the captured vessel, which they were. And now they were going to come in and destroy the Valkyrie while its marine teams were trapped on board the Blood Sovereign. And it was a good plan. It was actually an excellent plan, and it would have worked against any other species in the galaxy, but it was not going to work against humans because humans had a habit of surviving excellent plans. She gave the order that separated human commanders from every other species commanders. She said, "Recall all boarding teams immediately and prepare to detach from the Draxon vessel." And Marcus looked at her and said, "Ma'am, if we detach, we lose the ship and all the intelligence we just captured." And Sarah said, "Yes, we do." And then she said, "But my people are more important than their intelligence, and I will not leave them on that ship to die." And she said the other thing that made humans different. She said, "But before we go, we are going to make sure that ship is completely useless to them when we leave." and Marcus understood and began preparing the scuttling charges that the boarding teams had placed at key structural points throughout the Blood Sovereign as a standard precaution during any boarding operation. Because humans always planned for the possibility that they might need to destroy a captured vessel, and they had gotten very efficient at it. The recall order went out to all teams, and the Marines started pulling back to their entry points. And Okonkwo's team was the last to leave, because they were still in the bridge pulling the last of the intelligence data from the computer system. And Okonkwo personally carried the data core out of the bridge after downloading everything they could get, because even though Sarah had said the intelligence was less important than the people, Okonkwo knew that if he could grab it without costing anyone their life, then there was no reason not to. And that was the human way: maximize the gain while minimizing the cost, and never accept a binary choice when a third option existed. The incoming Draxon fleet was detected at full sensor range 12 minutes after the recall order. 14 ships, including 3 capital vessels and a mix of cruisers and destroyers, and they were accelerating toward the Valkyrie's position at maximum speed, clearly intending to catch the human ship before it could detach and escape. And Sarah watched the fleet approach on her display and made a series of calculations in her head that took approximately 3 seconds and resulted in a decision that would later be studied at every military academy in human space. She decided not to run. She decided to wait. And the reason she decided to wait was that the Draxon fleet was approaching in a standard pursuit formation, which meant they were focused on catching the Valkyrie and were not expecting the Valkyrie to turn and fight. And Sarah Chun had built her entire career on the principle that the best time to hit someone was when they did not expect it. The last Marine team cleared the Blood Sovereign and the magnetic anchors released, and the Valkyrie pulled away from the captured vessel just as the Draxon fleet entered weapons range. And the Draxon fleet commander opened a channel and started saying something in the Draxon language that Sarah's translator rendered as a demand for surrender and a promise of destruction. And Sarah let him talk for exactly 5 seconds, and then she said into her comm channel detonate, and the scuttling charges that the Marine teams had placed throughout the Blood Sovereign all detonated simultaneously. And the result was something that no one on the Valkyrie would ever forget for as long as they lived. The Blood Sovereign, the largest warship in the Draxon fleet, the vessel of unending conquest, the pride of the Draxon Empire, exploded from the inside out. And it did not just explode, it disintegrated, because the scuttling charges had been placed at precise structural weak points that human engineers had identified from the intelligence data they had captured during previous engagements. And the explosions propagated through the ship's frame in a chain reaction that was almost beautiful in its efficiency, and the 4-kilometer-long warship came apart in a cascade of fire and metal that lit up the void like a new star being born. And the shockwave hit the Draxon fleet that was still approaching in pursuit formation, and the lead ships were buffeted and thrown off course, and their shields flickered, and 2 of the destroyers actually lost power temporarily, because the electromagnetic pulse from the exploding flagship overloaded their systems. And in that moment of chaos and confusion and shock, the Valkyrie turned around and charged directly at the Draxon fleet with all weapons firing. The 3 frigates that had been providing support at the beginning of the engagement rejoined formation, and the 4 human ships hit the disrupted Draxon fleet like a hammer. And the Draxon fleet commander, who had been so confident 30 seconds ago, was now dealing with a situation that no model or simulation had prepared him for, because the ship he had been sent to protect was now a rapidly expanding debris field, and the humans were not running away, they were running toward him, and his fleet was in disarray, and his officers were looking at him waiting for orders, and he could not give them any because there were no orders for this situation in the Draxon tactical doctrine, because the Draxon tactical doctrine said that humans should always retreat when outnumbered and outgunned, and the humans were not retreating, they were attacking, and that was not supposed to happen. Sarah Chun had 12 minutes before the Draxon fleet recovered enough to bring their full firepower to bear, and she used every single one of those minutes with the precision of a surgeon and the aggression of a natural disaster. The Valkyrie's weapons hammered the nearest destroyer and broke its back with a full broadside that would have been excessive against a ship twice its size. And the frigates swarmed around the flanks of the Draxon formation, firing into any gap they could find and then disappearing before the Draxon point defense could track them. And the Draxon fleet was losing ships not because they were outgunned, but because they were confused and disorganized and fighting an enemy that was acting in ways that made no sense according to any of their training or experience. And humans had always been like that. Humans had always been the species that did the thing that made no sense, and then made it work through sheer force of will and refusal to accept that it should not work. And the Draxon fleet was learning again the lesson that they should have learned 47 years ago, which was that fighting humans was not like fighting anyone else, because humans did not follow the rules, and the rules were the only thing that kept wars from becoming slaughters. In 11 minutes and 42 seconds, the Valkyrie and its 3 frigates destroyed 4 Draxon vessels and damaged 3 more severely enough to take them out of the fight. And then Sarah gave the order to withdraw because the Draxon fleet was finally getting its act together, and the mathematical reality was that 4 human ships could not stand against 10 Draxon ships in a sustained engagement, no matter how much human determination and aggression could compensate for numerical inferiority. And the Valkyrie and its frigates disengaged and pulled away from the Draxon fleet at maximum speed, and the Draxons did not pursue because they were too damaged and too shocked and too busy trying to figure out what had just happened to organize an effective pursuit. And as the human ships pulled away, Sarah looked at the display and watched the debris field that had been the Blood Sovereign expanding slowly in the void. And she thought about the Marines who had died taking that ship, 12 of them, 12 humans who would not be going home. And she added their names to the list that every human commander kept in a place that never fully healed. And then she turned to Marcus and said, "Get me a secure channel to Fleet Command," and Marcus said it is already open, and Sarah spoke into the channel and said, "Valkyrie Actual, to Fleet Command Draxon flagship, destroyed Draxon relief fleet, engaged and damaged intelligence, secured human casualties 12 Kia, 23 WIA, request medical support at waypoint 7, and then she closed the channel and sat down in her command chair for the first time in 4 hours, and the bridge was quiet around her, and the stars outside the view screen were the same stars they had always been, but something had changed in this sector of space, because the Draxon Empire had just lost its most powerful warship, and its most powerful symbol in a single engagement, and the message that sent would ripple through the galaxy for years to come. The Draxon Empire would recover from this. They were too large and too powerful to be destroyed by a single engagement, no matter how spectacular, and they would rebuild their fleet, and they would continue to be a threat to the galactic peace. But something had shifted in the balance of fear that defined the relationship between the Draxons and the rest of the galaxy. Because for 600 years the Draxons had been the thing that other species feared. The Draxons were the apex predators of known space, and everyone else was prey. But then humans arrived, and the apex predator designation became contested, and today the humans had taken the Draxon flagship, the physical manifestation of Draxon power and pride, and they had filled it with explosives, and they had turned it into a firework, and every species in the galaxy that heard about this would understand the implication, which was that humans did not just defeat their enemies, they humiliated them. They turned their symbols of power into spectacles of destruction, and they did it with a casual efficiency that suggested they could do it again whenever they wanted. And that understanding would change the way the galaxy worked, because fear is the currency of power in interstellar politics, and the humans had just demonstrated that they had more of that currency than anyone had previously believed. Sarachin sat in her chair and watched the stars and thought about the intelligence data that Okonkwo had pulled from the Blood Sovereign's computer, the data that said the Draxons had known exactly who she was and exactly how she would respond. And she thought about the implications of that, because it meant the Draxons had been studying humans, really studying them. Not just cataloging their capabilities, but trying to understand their psychology and their decision-making processes, and that was both concerning and flattering because it meant the Draxons had finally realized that humans were not just another species to be conquered. Humans were a puzzle to be solved, and the Draxons were trying to solve them. And they had gotten part of the puzzle right, because they had correctly predicted Sarah's response to the bait. But they had gotten the most important part wrong because they had assumed that predicting the human response meant controlling the human response. And that was the mistake that every species kept making with humans. They confused understanding with control. They thought that because they knew what humans would do, they could plan for it, and contain it, and use it against them. But knowing what humans would do was not the same as being able to stop them from doing it. And the Draxons had learned that lesson today in the most expensive way possible. The Valkyrie reached waypoint 7 and the medical support ships were waiting and the wounded Marines were transferred with the quiet efficiency that marked all human emergency operations. And Sarah stood on the bridge and watched the transfer on the display and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make 12 dead Marines less dead or 23 wounded Marines less wounded. And the silence on the bridge was not an uncomfortable silence, it was a human silence, the kind of silence that humans use to process things that are too large for words. And eventually Marcus broke the silence not with words, but with a cup of coffee that he placed on the arm of her chair without being asked because he knew that she had not eaten or drank anything in 6 hours, and that was not sustainable, and humans took care of each other in small practical ways when the big things were too much to deal with. And Sarah picked up the coffee and drank it, and it was terrible because coffee on military ships was always terrible, but it was warm, and it was familiar, and it was human, and right now that was enough. The after-action report that Sarah filed over the next several hours was a model of military documentation, precise and detailed and comprehensive, and it included every tactical decision and every casualty report and every piece of intelligence that had been captured, and it was exactly the kind of report that would be studied by future commanders and analysts for decades to come. But there was one line in the report that stood out from all the technical data and tactical analysis, a single sentence in the conclusions section that summed up the entire engagement in a way that no amount of data could. And the sentence read, "The Draxon Empire sent their best ship to kill us, and we sent it back to them in pieces." And that sentence was not professional, and it was not objective, and it was not the kind of thing that should have been in an official military report, but Sarah left it in because sometimes the truth needed to be stated plainly and without decoration, and the plain truth of this engagement was that humanity had been challenged by the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and humanity had won. And the winning had not been elegant or clean or surgical. It had been brutal and costly and messy, but it had been a win, and wins were what humans collected, one at a time, year after year, until the pile of wins was so large that the losses disappeared beneath it. And that was how humans fought wars. They did not try to avoid losses. They simply accumulated enough wins to make the losses irrelevant. And the Draxons had never figured out how to counter that strategy, because the strategy was not really a strategy. It was just humans being humans. And you cannot counter a species' fundamental nature. You can only survive it or be destroyed by it. And the Draxon Empire was slowly learning which of those two options applied to them. The stars outside the view screen did not care about any of this. The stars were the same stars that had watched humanity climb out of the mud of their homeworld and build their first cities and fight their first wars and sail their first oceans and launch their first rockets and take their first steps on their moon and eventually reach up and touch the stars themselves. And the stars would still be there long after the Draxon Empire was gone and long after humanity had either spread across the galaxy or burned out and disappeared. And the indifference of the universe to human struggles was something that humans had always found oddly comforting, because it meant that nothing they did really mattered in the cosmic sense, and therefore they were free to do whatever they wanted without worrying about cosmic consequences. And what humans wanted, more than anything else, more than wealth or power or knowledge or comfort, was to prove that they could not be stopped, and today they had proved it again, against a ship that should have been unstoppable, against a fleet that should have been overwhelming, against odds that should have been insurmountable. And they had proved it the way humans always proved it, by refusing to accept that they should lose, and then not losing. And that refusal was the most powerful force in the galaxy, more powerful than any weapon or shield or technology. Because weapons could be countered and shields could be broken and technology could be matched, but the simple, stubborn refusal of a human being to accept defeat could not be countered or broken or matched by anything in this universe or any other. And the Draxons were learning that lesson today, and they would keep learning it tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that for as long as they chose to challenge a species that had never learned how to quit. The Valkyrie entered faster than light transit exactly 6 hours and 47 minutes after the first Draxon signature had appeared on its sensors, and as the stars stretched into the familiar streaks of FTL travel, Sarah Chun leaned back in her command chair and closed her eyes, and behind her eyelids she saw the blood sovereign exploding over and over again, a loop of destruction that would play in her memory for the rest of her life. and she let it play because that explosion was not just a tactical result. It was a message written in fire and metal and the deaths of 12 Marines who had given everything to deliver it. And the message was simple, and it was ancient, and it was the same message that humans had been sending since the first caveman picked up a rock and faced down a predator 10 times his size. And the message was this: you cannot have us. We will not go quietly. We will not submit. We will not break. And if you come for us with your flags and your ships and your pride and your power, we will take everything you bring, and we will break it into pieces and scatter those pieces across the stars, so that every species in the galaxy can see them and understand that humans are not prey. Humans were never prey. Humans are the thing that eats the thing that thought it was the top of the food chain. And the Draxon flagship was just the latest in a long line of things that had learned this lesson the hard way, and it would not be the last, because as long as there were species in the galaxy that thought they could challenge humanity, there would be humans ready to accept that challenge and turn it into an explosion visible from the next star system over. And that was not bravado or arrogance or recklessness. That was just humans being humans, and the galaxy was going to have to get used to it.